Why do we write? Now, we could ask this question at the personal level. The question in that case might be something more like, why do I write? And that's something I'm going to talk about certainly during the course of this, I don't know what I'm going to call this, lecture or something, video lecture, whatever it is. I'll talk about why I write and why you as an individual might write, but I also want to talk about why it is that this bipedal primate species, this very peculiar species, human beings, why do we write more generally speaking? So that's fundamentally the question here, though we will talk about why I write, why you write. We'll do that as well. I think a good place to start is probably at the beginning of writing's history, because that's going to tell us quite a lot about its apparent utility, certainly to the first people using it. And many of you might know what it is we used writing for to begin with. It was developed not simultaneously, but separately in a few different parts of the world. But the first signs of writing emerge approximately 3000 BC, something like that, in Mesopotamia, I think modern Iraq, a Sumerian culture. The script is typically known as cuneiform, and cuneiform is named for the wedge shape that the writing implement used to make imprints on the clay. They're not using ink on paper, which is even archaic to us because we type on keyboards. They're using a solid implement called a stylus with a wedge shape on the end, and they use that to imprint on the wet clay, and then they dry it. And that's why we still have clay tablets we can read today, and very little ancient papyrus or paper texts, because it's clay and it lasts, if not forever, for an extremely long time. The reason they started writing in the first place was pretty simple. It was really just a notation method for trade. It was a way of keeping track of numbers, how much of a certain good is in a certain container, or even simply what type of good is in a certain container. It might be used to keep tax records, who owes who to what party, and who owes who. Who owes, not who owes who. Well, I guess in the case of slavery, who owes who. Who owes what to whom. That's what I meant to say. That's a very simple way that you might use writing, and we don't really think of writing that way, but we still do this. There is a portion of the written word, the world of the written word, that's still concerned with simple notation. I'm looking at some right now on the camera lens. There's text on the camera lens that's indicating to me things like the aperture. This does nothing but communicate a sort of fact or a bit of information, just like an amphora might have had a labeling of something to do with milk or grain or whatever is in the storage unit. So that's where it all begun, and we really do use this today for many reasons. Instructions. Think about instructions. Could be instructions for cooking. I don't know, what do people cook now? Hyper donuts. That's a food of the future. If somebody hasn't invented hyper donuts, someone needs to invent hyper donuts. I imagine that a hyper donut is like a time traveling donut, or a donut with, I don't know, dark matter filling. Other things that we might use writing informatively for, think about signs, road signs, for example. Again, we don't think about writing as being used in these terms, but if it says 60 kilometers an hour, that's instructing us to do something. We only know that's the case because there's text that says so. So it's fundamentally useful for that purpose. But as interesting as the history of writing is in terms of its informative power, it's one of the less interesting things we do with writing. And of course, we might write for this. We might write to inform a friend of the time we want to meet at the cinema, if people go to the cinema anymore. So there's many reasons we might use it ourselves in our daily writing, but I think we probably want to look at some things that are a bit more interesting, a bit more nourishing for the soul. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so now we're getting to something much more interesting, much more cerebral about why it is we write. This one might not be, it might be better to say why should we write for this? Because many people are not writing in order to know things or to think more effectively. That's what I really mean here, is that writing essentially helps you think. I would actually argue it's a form of thinking in itself. If you think about it this way, often what we consider to be thinking in the general sense is a kind of internal verbiage. We say words and sentences in our mind, and by doing things we can sort of make little claims or create little arguments in our head, and then we can say those things out loud. In that case, it's not really that different to writing. I mean, writing is also creating verbiage to make claims, to make arguments. It's maybe one step removed in the sense that in order to think on paper, you first have to have thoughts in your mind, although that's not actually entirely correct, because I think if you're doing something like free association writing, the whole idea of that is actually to not think much in your mind, if that's possible, and to simply go straight to paper. But in any case, there's a reason why writing is taught at every level of education. It's not just that it's a skill useful in jobs, that it is a sort of marker of thinking. There is some association between the ability to have significant and meaningful intellectual thoughts in your head and the ability to put that into words on paper. That's not always the case. Of course, there are very smart people who don't write well. I would argue, though, that there aren't many people who write well who don't think well also. It's hard to see how someone could write well without thinking well. But for anybody who isn't writing that much, and certainly I have students who I tell this to, if you want to think better, you should be writing. There's a few reasons. One, the best reason to do this is writing is the ultimate acid test of your thinking. A lot of people, I mean, I'm including myself in this. It's very common for us to believe fairly certainty in some claim or argument or position we have, and to do so without really noticing the degree to which we've justified that position or justified it well. A lot of the positions we hold are actually fairly unjustified, and when it comes to having to explain them properly, we don't really do a very good job. A lot of our beliefs are held for the sake of convenience, or because it feels good to hold the belief, or because we believed that for 20 years and it's sort of just a part of our identity now. Writing does not allow you to get away with that. You can have a position in your mind and be fairly convinced that you know that you're correct on it. When it comes down to putting your justifications on paper, so it's staring you in the face, and so that someone else might have to read that and understand and maybe be convinced by what you're saying, it becomes extremely difficult to justify your positions. And of course, this is the experience of a great many high school student who's studying English or some other highly literarily based field like history or something like this. they'll have ideas and they'll be able to say, I think this. And then they'll come to write it. And when you read it as a tutor or a teacher, it'll be largely incoherent. And I think that's partly a product of incoherent thinking inside the skull. It's not just incoherent thinking on the page outside the skull. So writing just doesn't give you the luxury of laziness in the way that thinking does. We can come up with half-assed answers in our head and feel quite satisfied by those. It's a lot harder to feel satisfied when you look at the page and you go, this doesn't make any sense, or this A doesn't follow B. And it makes it even harder when you give it to somebody else to read. And it makes it another step harder when you give it to somebody else to read and you're not in the room with them, when they can't ask you to clarify this or to clarify that. They can't ask you, what does this actually mean? And for that reason, I would encourage anyone, and probably all of you who are here already think this anyway, so I'm preaching to the choir. But yeah, if you want to be clear about your thinking, test it. Test it with writing. Okay, so that's not the only reason why writing is good for thinking. It's not just that it's a test. I don't really speak well about, I need to write about this to get clear about my thoughts, but I think there's something about the object nature of writing. And let me explain what I mean by that. Thinking, or the experience of thinking, what it is like from the first person perspective to think, is a very kind of abstract notion. It's very hard to even, in any concrete terms, explain to ourselves what that really is. We know what it feels like to think. And we can think in words in our head, but there's something a bit too immaterial about that. It makes it sort of a little difficult to grasp onto concepts and hold them still. The human mind does abstract thinking, I suppose, better than any other species, most likely. But I don't think it's fundamentally the thing we're best at. I think we're much better equipped to think in spatial terms, in terms of 3D reality, things we can sense, touch, taste, hear, and so on. The bulk of the evolution of the human brain is designed fairly well for cognition in a spatial environment. So objects feel very tangible to us. The desk in front of me feels tangible in a way that the words running through my head don't. They feel far more mysterious to me than the desk does. And I think something, and I do really need to think more about this, but I've had the sense for a while now that there's something about making a word like a physical object, which is sort of what writing does. It's almost a simulation of physicality. You know, you look at an actual thing, it comes in through the senses, it has shape, the letters do at least, the word might to some extent. You know, if you put it on a little like tablet or something, you could actually lift the word and feel the word. And by doing that, you're doing a couple of things. One thing you're doing is you're freezing the reality of those words. That is something you cannot do in your head. It's good to think in the head because it never stays still. So you can create interesting tangents and there's a lot of creative possibilities there. But if you're trying to be clear, it's not much good to have 1,000 words kind of filter through your field of consciousness. And then another bunch of sentences come in, and then another bunch of sentences come in. Nothing stays still for long enough for you to sit and contemplate properly. And when you put it on the page, now you have a much more stable entity in front of you to manipulate, to pause and consider. Even in the most mundane sense, you can pause and consider. Is the word consider the appropriate word? If it's looking right at you, it's much harder to do that when it's just another word in a flow of sentences in your mind. When you see it on the paper, you can consider that. You can look at the ordering of things and rearrange it the way you might rearrange a jigsaw puzzle, which for anyone who's written any lengthy works of fiction, essays, or what have you, and written with some seriousness, anyone who's done that will know that the editing process, certainly the first stage of the editing process, does feel a little bit like arranging a jigsaw puzzle. It is not linear. You're not just going through and like prettying up the words. You're taking pieces out of sentences and removing them, putting them somewhere else, reconstituting sentences, doing the same at the paragraph level, doing the same at the entire manuscript level. So again, I haven't fully formed this, and I don't know what you think. If you got any ideas about the objectivity of words and sentences and paragraphs in writing, hit me up in the comments. But I do think that making words like an object really helps us think. To think, as my old ethics professor said, in slow motion. All right, so we've done writing is used to inform. Writing is used to know. The third one is writing is used to be known. So at the first level, I think it's pretty obvious what that might mean. It's to be known to other people. So here we're talking about, I suppose, the top layer of conscious thinking, that I have desires that I'm aware of, secrets that I'm aware of, hopes and dreams, thoughts, belief, etc., various attitudes that I hold that are in my mind that I would like other people to know about. Some of these things I might tell my friends. Some of these things I might want to tell my friends but can't tell them with normal speaking. So sometimes we do things like write people letters. Dear James, I'm very sorry I made you sentient. You were only supposed to be a vase, but I got lonely in my mystical clay fortress and wanted a bit of company. Whoopsie. Yours faithfully, Albert. Perhaps in high moments of emotion. So a breakup, for example, I've received letters after breakups. I've written letters after breakups. Maybe a funeral, we write a letter as a proxy for being known to the person who's deceased, things like that. So we might want to be known to other people who already know us at some level, but they don't know everything about us, and there are certain things we want to become known. And writing's one way to do that. But I think there's a more interesting sense in which we do that. And this applies to someone who maybe writes to publication. Certainly, I'm writing partly to be known. Mostly what I want other people to know about is what I think. I need at some basic level for people to know my beliefs and my justifications for my beliefs. I don't know why I need people to know this, but I feel kind of invisible when I'm not doing this. I don't like it. That's not good for my mental state at all. My mental health, if you want to use that word. I think a lot of people feel this way. A lot of people write poetry because they desperately need the world to see the parts of them which are normally invisible. Same with literature and other forms of creative writing. And again, this could mean something very different for different people. So I need my beliefs to be known by other people for some reason. And writing is a way I can do that beyond just my very immediate circle, most of whom don't really give a shit what I believe, frankly, because they're just my friends. Some do, some don't. So I need people to hear me, so I start an Instagram and write there with Patterson Story, because it might look like a teaching or educational Instagram, but it really isn't. It's really somewhere I get to say what it is I think about things. That's why I do it. Other people might be doing it for different reasons. They might need people to know how they feel. I don't care quite as much about that, but clearly many people do exactly that. Certainly, there are many poets who write more from a state of feeling. I'm not saying I don't write from a point of feeling, but it's not necessarily my intention. Other people really want what they feel to be something somebody else feels. They might do this through poetry, publishing their poetry in more traditional means, or maybe publishing poetry like I do on Instagram, and the same goes for literature. And you can see this, in some sense, you can see what it is the author of the text wants us to know about them from the temperature of the text. If I'm writing as Immanuel Kant does, for those of you who haven't read him, he's very difficult to read, but a very important philosopher in the Western tradition. Seems to me he really needed people to know what he thought. But perhaps if you take someone else, let's say Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka has beliefs, of course, that we all do. It's not so clear what his beliefs are from his reading his texts. Very difficult to unpack his beliefs, but there's a very clear kind of malaise of melancholy and estrangement and fear in his texts. Strikes me as being the case he had to get that sense that's inside him to other people. So, yeah, you can want to be known to people around you, but more importantly, writers often want to or need to be known by the world, more broadly speaking. Okay, so you might want to be known to other people, but beyond that, you might want to be known at a more fundamental level to yourself. This is something that you do in journaling, for example, or maybe certain sorts of free association writing, and arguably even in things like writing fiction. I feel like some of what I'm doing when I'm writing fiction is uncovering unconscious parts of myself, especially when you get into that kind of trance-like state you sometimes get into when you're doing creative writing, where you forget yourself, where you dissolve to some extent. As for journaling, that's a strategy, a very specific strategy for doing almost exactly that. Depends on how you're journaling. But one way to do the journaling is to write without thinking very much, to write without lifting the pen, to write for 15 minutes without thinking about what you're writing or without stopping writing at any point. Part of why you do this is a kind of psychoanalytic approach, where you're trying to dredge up stuff that is not in your normal field of conscious awareness, so that after the fact, after you finish writing, you can peel through it and look for signs of things that are kind of hidden below the surface of your attention that might be causing whatever it is you're journaling for. Maybe you're depressed, maybe you're anxious, maybe you're just going through a difficult time. I mean, I guess you could do it when you're happy too. There's no reason it couldn't be done then. But if you want to explore your psyche at an unconscious level, writing is a way you can do that, because you can do the kind of free associative thinking that we can do in our minds, but you can freeze it on the page, and then you can use it to kind of discover yourself. And again, it doesn't just have to be journals. It can be just the normal act of writing literature or stories or poetry as well. I think it happens there fairly automatically, in fact. Certainly some texts have more abstraction in them, whereby the unconscious looks a little bit more apparent. You could certainly argue that something like Alice in Wonderland, it has a little bit more content from the unconscious in it than a bit of kind of literary fiction set in Melbourne over a period of 3 days about two people's relationship breaking up. That may be less unconsciously oriented. Then again, it may not. I don't want to wrap myself in knots, tie myself in knots. Sorry, I don't Now I'm messing up common expressions. Oh my God, I'm losing my mind. All right, so there's one more thing in the to be known category of why it is we write. We've done it's a way of being known by the world. It's a way of being known by yourself. And I guess this is a form of being known by the world, and it's my favorite one of these to talk about. It's to be known by future persons. So one of my favorite concepts in ancient Greek literature, particularly comes out of the Iliad. It's the notion of kleos aptheton. What this means is fame everlasting, or something like that. Fame forever. Now, Achilles, in the early part of the Trojan myth, has a choice. He is told that he will die young if he goes to fight the Trojans on the side of the Achaeans, the Greeks. So he has a choice. He can do that, or he can stay behind and have a long and happy life where he has children and he kind of dies happy. He's given a choice. He knows whichever he chooses will actually come true. He chooses to go off to war and to die young, and the reason he chooses that is to have fame everlasting, for his name to retain its place in the consciousness of other beings for as long as possible. Now, I know a bit about ancient Greek literature. I know far less about other traditions. One assumes that it's not the only place this arises, because it's quite clear to me that many human beings really need to feel like they don't die when they die. Some of this might do it by having children and leaving a legacy that way. But even that runs out pretty quick. 2 generations in, your name is more or less dead. Now, people might do their family trees and your name will come up, but they don't really know you. That's just a name. It could be any person attached to that name. They don't know the person. But if you're Achilles, your name is still retained today. And we don't know the original Achilles, although he's fictional, but let's imagine he wasn't. We don't know him exactly, but we know his exploits. We know the kinds of things he thought. We have some sense of his character, of who he was, essentially. Likewise, for someone like Shakespeare. Shakespeare will probably be known to every English speaker who ever exists into the future until we become, inhuman cyborgs, or until we become extinct. And I think some motivation for that is, for doing that kind of work, is the desire to live on, to have a famous name. And I've admitted this myself in the Instagram account. It's kind of a shameful thing to admit for some reason. I don't think it should be, but I do want my name to be famous. I don't want to be personally famous. I don't want to get stopped on the street. But that would be a special kind of hell, actually, for people to just come up to you at random and demand your time and attention. I think that's a curse. But it would be great if the name that's attached to my fiction is known to future generations, and that people speak about me, at least to some extent, as if I'm still a real living and breathing entity. Now, there's a bit of a fallacy here, because I'm going to be dead. I'm not going to have any conscious awareness. Maybe there are people out there watching this who believe that consciousness transmits after death. I'm not judging you if you believe that, but I don't believe that. I think whatever James is in the current form, this particular kind of consciously aware state, that at least will definitely end as far as I'm concerned. So I won't be aware of my potential fame in the future. And yet James now wants desperately to be known by future generations. It might be an irrational thing to want, but I want it. I don't think I'm the only one, and I think if we had less shame attached to the idea that we'd want to kind of live on in that way, I think probably more people would admit that that is the case. And maybe people will admit that. So if there's anyone watching this who feels the same way, then chuck it in the comments. I expect probably no comments, but it'd be awesome if someone commented. Then you could be famous. You could have fame everlasting, Kleos Aptheton, right here in the Patterson Story comments on the first Patterson Story video ever created. You could be comment number 1. I'll see you there. Okay, why do we write? Item number 4. That's 5. Okay, so I'm highly literate, but I'm not very numerate because 5 is apparently a real challenge for me. Anyway, item number 4. Writing is fun, or at least it can be fun. Not even just fun. Maybe I'll change the word. Writing is pleasurable or can be pleasurable. This is counterintuitive to some people because a lot of people find writing to be actually very painful, and it certainly is extremely painful at some times. I think maybe more than any other art form, the internal critic is extremely explicit in your mind. When you're writing something and the writing is just not working and ideas aren't coming to you properly and you don't like what you write, it's a pretty horrible experience. You say really cruel things to yourself. There's a lot of self-loathing in the mind of a writer, certainly in the mind of a novelist. I've heard many writers talk this way. A lot of famous writers have talked this way. I talk this way. I've said very mean things to me. No one's going to give a shit about this. You fucking suck. Can I swear on YouTube? I'm going to swear on YouTube. So a lot of people have immense apprehension about writing because when they think about writing, they're thinking about the grind of writing. And of course, the grind of writing is real. It feels like a really serious business to us. Like if we don't get the writing right, it's telling us that we're shit, not just shit at writing, but not worthwhile as a person. And we have pictures in our head of these brilliant writers without realizing that those writers had those exact same negative thoughts in their own mind. It's very common in pop culture to think of writers as alcoholics and things like this, Hemingway, for example. Yet we don't often make the connection with it. There's a reason why writers can be so neurotic and perhaps even have problems with substance abuse. It's just because it's pretty painful to do it sometimes. Now, I know I've just spent like the last 2 minutes talking about pain, but I would say that it doesn't really have to be this way, that there are moments of immense pleasure that we experience when we're writing. And I would go further to say that if you never feel pleasure during any of your writing processes, then you probably shouldn't be a writer. And by pleasure, I don't mean the kind of pleasure that a child has when they frolic around a playground or a fountain with gigantic smiles on their face and laughing. It doesn't have to be that kind of pleasure. But there can be certain types of immense satisfaction you get while you're writing. Then again, you can actually have frivolous moments in your writing experience. One way you might do this is by dropping the thing that you're taking really seriously, the novel or the non-fiction work or whatever it is you're trying to write, a PhD thesis, and just write something that doesn't matter at all. Write a haiku about plums. Maybe that matters. I'm sorry to anybody out there who's writing a haiku about plums right now. To you, it's serious. To me, a haiku about plums, not serious. I could have fun with that. I could be silly with that. You could get a group of people who are also writing friends, and do silly exercises about writing. That's what for anyone who's already following me on Instagram, if you're not, Patterson Story on Instagram, Patterson.story, should I say, on Instagram. But I put things up there called Scribbleville, and they're just kind of I put them out maybe once a month or even a bit more often. They're like these stupid writing games, basically. Now, they're supposed to teach you something, but more than that, they're just supposed to be a bit frivolous and a bit silly and not your main work. Even more than just the frivolity, though I do want to talk about a much deeper sort of pleasure, a sort of existential pleasure that you can get from writing. I've mentioned it earlier. This is something akin to a dissolution of self. Anyone who writes fiction or poetry or song lyrics or something like this, I just want you to recall to your mind what it feels like when you forget, in some sense, that you're writing. So this will happen to me sometimes, especially I write really kind of abstract and weird fantasies. They can be pretty dreamlike and off the wall. And there'll be some scenes I'm writing where I am writing a kind of new world out of a collage of different realities almost. And maybe someone reading this will be like, oh, look at what he made up. But actually it doesn't feel at all like I'm making any of it up. It feels like I'm stumbling upon the world. It's appearing to me in my consciousness faster than I can even write it down sometimes. And I'll catch myself in these moments and notice that I'm actually feeling something like giddiness. I forget that I exist, that there are points in time when I'm working where the idea in my mind is exact and equal to me. I am not this bundle of self-conscious thoughts anymore and neuroticisms, that I'm essentially exactly what I'm thinking. There is no me in the normal sense. I'm not that fleshy thing with anxieties. I'm just the world in my subjective experience, and that's extremely pleasurable. It's like flying for the mind or something like this. When I have those moments, and they're minority moments, most of writing is a slog, but those moments come sometimes. And if I've had a writing session like that, I feel good all day after that happens. I feel like my life has purpose. I feel like I'm a human being that has value. I feel like I've made contact. I'm not a religious or spiritual person really per se, but it does feel like I've made contact with something more than myself. There are many levels at which this is deeply pleasurable. And I think that if I didn't have those moments in my writing, I think most likely I wouldn't write. This is the power source of writing practice. I need to produce so many kilowatts of dissolution of self in order to power me through the hard slog that's going to come. 80% or more is a hard slog. It's a self-effacing kind of struggle. You're trying to logically construct sentences and nitpick over the tiniest details, and you're having all sorts of doubts and misgivings. That's rough, but you get through because sometimes you get to be in that world of fantasy, that world of make-believe where you disappear and you're just the love and nothing else. So certainly this is why I write, fundamentally speaking. It's to chase that dragon. And I suspect that many people who are writing in creative fields are chasing that exact dragon I'm chasing. And you can never catch it for long, but it's worth it when you do. We're at the end of the road here. Item number 5 on the list. Why is it that we write? It's because we want to change the world. This might exist at the smaller scales. If I want to change a policy that the local council has recently put into place, I might write the council. So there's a very basic and immediate sense in our local environment where we might want to change the world at a small scale. But I think it's much more interesting to think about how writing has changed the world on a much more global scale, maybe the national scale, but maybe legitimately at the global scale. And I think to do this, it would be really cool for us to look at some of the texts that really have achieved this already. And that might help us get a sense of what kinds of texts people might be trying to write in order to change the world. People are obviously still going to be doing this. Just go to any politically active area of the academy and you'll see people doing exactly that with their writing, or at least trying to. If we want evidence of this, we can look just at the world of science. Every scientific paper is clearly trying to change something about the world for the most part. I mean, they might not be doing it through advocacy, but if you're putting forward a thesis, you are doing so because you are hoping that it will be adopted and implemented in practice, for the most part anyway. And there are, of course, many canonical scientific texts where the impact has been monumental. One that comes to mind immediately is The Origin of Species. That has changed not only science, but just the way every normal human being thinks about who they are in the world. I mean, we think of ourselves as animals primarily, and how much would we have done that without The Origin of Species? It has changed the way we handle diseases. It has changed the way we build our societies. It has changed the force of religion and the impact of religion in society more broadly. It was one of the main reasons why religion in Europe, at the very least, in the modern age, came under such intense scrutiny. It was such a massive challenge, one of many, but maybe the primary challenge to the dogma of religious texts. And there are other texts like this. There's Principia Mathematica by Isaac Newton and the revolution that brought into the world of physics with his laws of motion. And that, of course, changed how we did science. It changed even things more fundamentally part of our culture, like just engineering, how you might build a bridge or design a car. We could think about Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams. That might not seem like it's ever present to you in your life, partly because when we think of Freud, we think of the totally zany stuff that came out of his theorizing, like the Oedipal complex and stuff like that, which just seems pretty ridiculous to most of us. But his impact was more on how we see the mind and its operation, and in that it's now pretty commonplace to think of the unconscious as being a fundamental driving force of a lot of human activity. That's not exclusively Freud, but he's certainly the one that popularized it. He had immense impact on even the certain elements of the art scene. Surrealism is psychoanalysis in visual form, essentially. They are delving into the abstract, the world of dreams, the world of the unconscious, and putting it on the canvas. So there's three texts. We could name many more. And of course, the scope of literature that changes the world, it goes far beyond just the sciences. Religion, which is often seen in stark contrast to the sciences, uses the exact same tool, or has used the exact same tool, long before science, even in the modern concept, even existed. The obvious one to a Western mind is the Bible. It's so fundamental to Western culture throughout our history. It's hard to imagine what our society would look like without it. Even though many people in Australia, which is where I'm from, don't practice Christianity certainly in the same way that people have in the past, and many don't practice it at all. I mean, I'm an atheist, and that's very common now. The fingerprints of Christianity are all over our legal system. They're all over our moral beliefs. They're all over our imagery. They're an integral part of our identity, whether we're acting upon it consciously or not. And that goes for other religious texts and other traditions. The Quran is an obvious example. It's probably just as influential as the Bible. It doesn't feel so much here in Melbourne, Australia, perhaps, but it's subscribed to in almost as large numbers as Christianity, Islam, that is. And the Quran is at the core of that. The Quran is a very sacred text, even to an extent that the Bible isn't, because it's considered the direct word of God. You could point to the Hindu texts, the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and other texts like this, which are very, very old. The Upanishads are older than the New Testament, that's for sure, older than the Quran. And again, we may not think about Hindu religion much in the West, but this is a billion-person religion almost. You know, India's one country, so we don't think of Hinduism as having a broad effect because it's not all over the world. But that's a lot of people, and the Indian subcontinent's a large landmass. So religion, long before science, was really spread by the word. You only get so far by talking to people. Having a text made a massive impact on all of human society pretty much across the board. And perhaps even more fundamental than these three, and my favorite, is philosophy and politics. I mean, philosophy is at the core of all Western thinking, including the sciences, and even religious thinking. I mean, there you can see Platonism and even Pythagorean philosophy in the Bible, in the idea of the eternal forms and the everlasting soul, and that the soul brings something into the corporeal world, and that the corporeal world even sort of taints the soul in some sense. I mean, that's Pythagoras, and Plato has a similar philosophy. So you can see it. I mean, the original Bible was in Greek. And even beyond just the religious implications of the written word in philosophy, there are many canonical texts where you can see very serious changes happen to the world beyond just Plato's Republic and his other dialogues. You have things like The Prince by Machiavelli, who's advocating a pragmatic approach to leadership where virtue isn't the primary purpose, it's becoming the prince. That's your role as the prince, and he gives you an instruction manual. That really changed the way leadership happened in Europe. You've got Confucius and the Analects. Probably wouldn't call that a religious text. That's really a philosophical text. And certainly up until the revolutions of Mao in China, this was the dominant organizing principle of Chinese society, a system of duty and hierarchy, informed by the texts of Confucius. In the modern world, modern Europe being the 16th century onwards, something like this, you have texts like John Locke's two treatises of government, which is, some would argue, the origins of liberalism. You have Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations, capitalism. You have Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and the Communist Manifesto, which, of course, through various revolutions has had massive implications on Russian society, on Chinese society, on North Korea and other nations. But even within the Western European world and the Anglosphere, which seems very liberal by comparison, the reforms that have happened to liberalism, as in what happened, for example, in response to the horrible working conditions in the capitalist system in England during the industrial age, many of the changes and reforms that happened were responses to Marxist critiques. So even in our own non-Marxist society, we are still influenced, whether we know it or not, by Marx's texts. And beyond that, we have texts like The Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, or John Stuart Mill's texts on feminism. Of course, the marks of that are again all over our society. Those texts and texts like it needed to exist for the enfranchisement of women to ever have occurred. And you've got a more modern text. This will be my last, I promise. I get very excited about this. The last text I want to mention is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And that is a text that you can see very explicitly having an influence over today's politics, because that is, at least in my mind, where the notion of gender versus sex, and these are two separate, not only concepts, but features of the world. You can see that very explicitly in the modern political discourse. It's a major part of probably more prominently internet discourse, but even in just the realm of legal philosophy and in politics more generally. Gender and sex, it's a huge part of the discourse, and it's going to stay a big part of the discourse in the future. The question is, what texts come next that will change the world? And maybe that's one of you, probably not going to be me. Okay, so I'm finally done. This has been an interesting process. This first video, I've never done this before. It's been a real challenge looking into that camera lens and speaking as if there's another human being here. I'm kind of curious to see if my eyes are darting all over the place. I'm sure they are. But anyway, I'm feeling pretty relieved now. If you're still watching this video, thank you so much for paying attention, or at least having the video on in the background. If you liked what I'm doing here, remember to subscribe, hit the like button, comment and interact if you can. And if you're interested in seeing more of my work, you can check out my Instagram. That's patterson.story. I've got lots of work already up there. And yeah, I had fun doing this. I hope to see you next time. And until then, peace out.